but they do make me sneeze. Yeah.
This type of plant?
Lilies.
Lilies.
We had sunshine in England, so
yeah, so just an exchange. Okay. You never know. No, this is not really no, for Milan it's good.
yeah, is it often? No, well,
No, it's flat, but continental climate. So please, James.
I'm okay.
dovete staccarli. So, good morning, everybody. I'm Rossella Speroni. I'm the event manager here at the EU Pavilion, and I would like to give you our welcome to this meeting room and welcome to our pavilion. The pavilion was created under the coordination of the Joint Research Center, which is a Directorate General of the Commission, and one of its sites is close to Milan, is on the Lake Maggiore in Ispra. The coordination was so given to the Commission, but this project puts together European Commission, European Parliament, European Council, and all the agencies and institutions connected to the European institutions. We created a visitor experience that I invite you to visit on the ground floor, where you can discover the world of Alex and Silvia. Alex is a farmer and Silvia is a scientist. And there is this cartoon, 8 minutes cortometraggio with 4D, so with special effects that I hope you can see and so enjoy this project. This floor, the first floor, is the institutional part of our pavilion, since there is this meeting room in which we hosted a lot of conferences. In fact, in our calendar, in EXPO calendar, in 6 months, we have in our calendar more than 230 scientific events. Not only here, but also in other locations, in Milan city center, in the various universities, and at the Jersey in Ispra. So, I wish you can have a fruitful meeting and welcome from all our group. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Luca Colombo. I'm the Secretary General for the Italian Foundation for Research in Organic and Biodynamic Agriculture. And I will chair this Glamur event jointly with my colleagues. EXPO is, of course, a very suitable occasion and place for a project like Glamur. Glamur is responding to an EU call which was asking for a comparative analysis of global versus local food supply chains. And I underline this versus because it was a real challenge for us to look at this potential dichotomy. The way we, as the Glamur Consortium, meant to address this topic was to explore the multidimensional path of the performance of these value chains. And the Glamur Consortium is composed by 15 partners in 10 European countries, and some of the partners are here represented on the podium. I'm very glad to share this event with them and very grateful for their collaboration. And I want to reassure or probably disappoint you because even though we are supposed to talk about global versus local, we are probably not talking about a competition. So we will not debate a competition. This is not our approach. We will try to assess the multidimensional elements of these value chains performance. And what we wanted to show in this multidimensional approach that there are many ways to assess the sustainability. And we identified in the project 5 dimensions. So the economic, social, environmental, the health dimension, and also the ethical dimension. And to do that, we also used 7 value chains, notably wheat, in terms of grain, in terms of bread, wine, pork meat, fruit and vegetables, and dairy. So these are the value chains that we used to compare in 2 different countries, in local and global value chains, to compare their sustainability and to assess their performance. So I will just go through very quickly to the end of my short introduction. This is the program we have. Unfortunately, Gianluca Brunori, which is collaborating with FIRAB, is not attending. Gianluca Brunori is the scientific coordinator of the Glamur project. He's a University of Pisa professor. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us, but James Kirwan accepted to take over, and I'm very grateful for his really valuable collaboration. So I'm going to introduce my colleagues one by one. Damien, May, they will introduce themselves, so I will just rush through the names, but Damien May, Emilia Schmidt, Francesca Galli, James Kirwan, and Keith de Roost. So I'm very glad to leave the floor to James, but finally I just want to inform you that the Glamur website, glamur.eu, is our reference website. So most, if not all, the Glamur information are available on this website, and I encourage you to explore it, to download our project reports, and also to see the blog part of this website, because we try to report some Glamur relevant information on this part of the website. So I thank you for coming, and I leave the floor to James. Many thanks.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Luca for that introduction. So, as Luca said, I'm giving this paper really on behalf of Gianluca Brunori, and I have developed it together with Damien, and we both work for the Countryside and Community Research Institute, which is based in the UK. And the topic is the multidimensionality of food chain performance assessment, which is, in essence, what the Glamur project is about. So the starting point for Glamur was this incentive to acknowledge complexity within food supply chains. And this in part is as a result of a significant interest in sustainable consumption practices, but also more broadly that throughout the media, food supply chains are getting more and more coverage, and there is a recognition of the growing complexity of them and the need to give a more multidimensional assessment of their respective performance. Industry responses have often been in terms of conducting life cycle analysis, which, as far as they go, might be quite useful, but they tend to focus predominantly on the environmental dimension, Luca mentioning that we're looking at 5 different dimensions. They also tend to be developed by the people who are assessing their own products. So in a sense, there is a technopolitics, a self-serving element to the development of those techniques. Whereas we want to go beyond that, and we want to recognize these multiple dimensions. We also want to recognize that it's not simply the established players who have an input into what might be understood as the performance of food supply chains. We want to respect that there are a wider range of legitimate perspectives that need to be heard. The author here, Claire Hinrichs, also talks about an idea she terms intensifying circumstances, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with, ideas of climate change, price volatility, nutrition security, issues of governance, value extraction, and so on within food supply chains. So as a result of that, we need to think more broadly. We need to enlarge our thinking about food systems change. We need to be more encompassing in what we understand to constitute the performance of food supply chains. And in this respect, an important starting point for the Glamur project was to think about things through the lens of post-normal science. So not rely exclusively on academics or technicians to define what we should be looking at, but to look more broadly, to recognize that in fact, there is enormous complexity, enormous uncertainty. And if we think, for example, about climate change, a lot of incomplete data. These are models based on data that, depending on what you plug in, you get very different answers out, and so on. And also within post-normal science, very importantly, this idea that multiple stakeholder perspectives are explicitly acknowledged. So we are looking to include people who might not have been included previously. And in this sense, there is a democratization of knowledge. It's opening up the terms of debate more broadly to everybody who might have an interest in food supply chains. And within Glamur, we have sought to develop methods to capture this complexity and thereby to provide both consumers but also policymakers with better tools on which to base their decisions about which food supply chains to support, either through developing policies or through their behavioral practices, buying through one chain rather than another. The conceptual framework that underpinned Glamur is in three different elements. The first one is looking at the socio-economic context, which is broadly what I'm talking about now and will continue to talk about. And here we are coming from the starting point of discourses, looking at discourses and how meanings are attributed within particular both socio-economic but also geographical contexts. And this is not necessarily the normal way of thinking about the performance of food supply chains, that more normally you would be starting with indicators. What are the indicators that allows me to assess food supply chains? But we've gone a stage before that. A lot of work went in prior to the development of indicators. And then the three papers that are going to be given by my colleagues subsequently will be looking at the food chain impacts through indicators. So it's looking at the socio-economic context, then looking at the food chain impacts, and then ultimately the choice, which I mentioned earlier, which is what hopefully we will have time for in the interactive workshop session at the end. So on the back of that, the project rationale, the Glamur project rationale, is to align the multiple meanings that are attributed to food chains, having regard for the contexts involved, and that's not only the geographical context, but also the socio-economic context as well, in order to create a common understanding of food chain performance. And what we mean here by a common understanding, we don't envisage that everybody will feel exactly the same way or that you will come out with a single understanding of performance, but it is simply that everybody who is interested can have the tools available to them to see that depending on where you are coming from, your approach, your perspective in relation to food supply chains, you do understand that there are a range of different ways of assessing or understanding the performance of food supply chains. And as I mentioned earlier, the idea is to give decision makers, whether consumers or policymakers, adequate cognitive tools or knowledge or understanding to pursue more sustainable consumption and production practices. So how do we put this approach into practice? Well, it started with conducting a systematic analysis of how the performance of food supply chains is perceived, and the word perceived and perceptions is critical to this process, but also defined and communicated across a range of different spheres. And I'll explain a little bit more about these in a moment, but the public sphere, the scientific sphere, the market sphere, and the policy sphere. And furthermore, these different spheres are examined according to the 5 dimensions that Luca mentioned earlier, the economic, social, environmental, which are usually looked at, and within Glamur it was important too, with its focus on food, to reflect also the health and ethical dimensions. And to assess how each of these dimensions is framed within different contexts. We were looking at 10 different European countries, but in addition, Senegal and Peru as well, so a total of 12 different countries. And we were looking within these different discussions, these different perceptions, for dilemmas, contradictions, but also areas of interaction and confluence of ideas and the development of more sustainable discourses within these different contexts. And as a result of that, to develop a matrix, which I will show you what that involves in a moment, that catalogues food supply chain performance. It brings together this hugely disparate and complex range of perspectives and views and allows us to try and understand them and hopefully to develop them and to put them into practice through policy or through individual action. I think it's worth just spending a moment or two being a little clearer what we mean by dimensions and spheres. What we mean by dimensions and spheres in this context. I think probably we're all very familiar with dimensions, the normal economic, social, and environmental. But as I say, health and ethical are key within the context of food and therefore have been included. Spheres can be thought of as a space of communication, an arena of interaction where discourses take place, where discourses can be argued, where people can come to some kind of agreement or understanding of what they understand by performance within that particular context. And the key thing that identifies or differentiates between the different spheres is the objects around which the discourses take place. So if we think about the market sphere, that will tend to be around commodities. The public sphere is around common good or public goods. Scientific sphere around legitimate truth claims, which is where traditionally a lot of these ideas would have come from. And the policy sphere is around the development of policy and putting policy into practice. So the countries involved, you will see there that the first 10 are European countries, and then in addition we also were looking not quite as fully, but to some extent, certainly in this part of the project, we were also looking at Senegal and Peru as well. And the result of doing this, there is geographical context involved, but also those different countries have very different political and socioeconomic backgrounds, contexts, cultures, and so on in relation to food. And this was very interesting. For example, there are huge differences between the Latvian context and the UK and the Netherlands, for example. So the individual partners were carrying out case studies of individual commodities, which I'll give you an example of in a moment. And then it was necessary for the UK team, Damien and I, to do a comparative analysis of all these individual reports that were coming in. So the case studies were conducted in what was known as pairs of pairs. So you had two countries working together, for example, the UK and Italy, and they would be looking at a particular product, which Francesca will be talking about in a moment. So we have cheese, which was looked at in the UK and in Switzerland, and Amelia will talk about it. We have wine, which was looked at in France and Switzerland. And then we have ham, which was looked at in Italy and, can't see them, I think, the Netherlands, sorry. And then bread, which was Italy and the UK. And then we had vegetables, which were looked at in Spain and Belgium. And then the final one was fruit, which was compared between Latvia and Serbia. And so in each case, they were looking, for example, Latvia and Serbia were both looking at fruit. It would then be possible to make comparisons between these commodities, the different socioeconomic and geographical contexts. So the comparative methodology, when all these different reports landed in our inboxes at the CCRI, it was a little bit of a nightmare. We had roughly 100-page reports, and we had 12 of them we had to make some sense of. So the critical thing was to try and identify the principal discourses and controversies concerning the performance of food supply chains within each of these different contexts, and to try and see whether there were themes, there were areas of conflict, areas of agreement, and so on, and to draw out the diversity of meanings and perceptions that were associated with food supply chains in these different places. And on the back of that, to develop a multi-criteria performance matrix that incorporates this huge diversity of understandings and discourses across both the 5 dimensions and the 4 spheres. And this is the much heralded multi-criteria performance matrix, and I'll talk you through it. There are 24 different words or short phrases here which we have termed as attributes, so attributes of food supply chain performance. And behind each of these attributes is a 2 or 3 page thick description within the individual reports. And I will give you an example of one such description so that you can understand a little bit more about the thinking. And should you be interested, you can have a look at the full report on the Glamur website. So across the top of the matrix there, you've got the 5 dimensions, economic, social, and so on. And down the left-hand side, you have the 4 different spheres that I introduced a moment ago. And if you look in blue, territoriality, for example, appears in 3 different cells, and a number of the different attributes appear in more than one cell. This is to be expected, and there's a case to be made for some of them to put them in 10 or so cells, but actually the decision was taken that that would be rather unhelpful because we're trying to bring things together to create a degree of harmony and understanding, and the potential for people to understand the complexity through relative simplicity, if you like. But having said that, we have, in a number of cases, felt that we couldn't just conflate it to simply one cell, and therefore in a number of cases it's in more than one. Just some brief comments upon the general makeup of the attributes. In the reports and indeed in the matrix, there has tended to have been a dominance in the economic dimension, which I think, again, is somewhat inevitable in that this has often and indeed is usually the starting point for evaluating food supply chains. But the social and environmental also had very comprehensive coverage. The health, less so, although in most reports there is an emphasis on food safety and nutrition as being the 2 key health elements. And it's important to understand that things like obesity would be encompassed within nutrition, for example. Ethical within Glamur has been slightly more problematic. It hasn't been very broadly covered within the reports. And the main reason for that is that it is often inherent, it's often implicit within other descriptions within the process of identifying different attributes. Interaction between the different spheres is also obvious and evident within the reports, especially, for example, science will inform public policy. It might be that the public debate about food, what the consumer wants, will influence the market sphere, for example. So if I just talk you fairly briefly now through one of these 24 attributes, the creation and distribution of added value. So this has 2 elements to it, not only how value is created, but also critically how it is distributed within food supply chains. For example, there was a recognition that global food supply chains often create a lot of value, but the distribution of that added value isn't always evenly or arguably fairly distributed throughout that chain. So that's a big challenge. And the bottom part of this slide here shows how this particular attribute is associated directly with a number of other attributes, and that's a way, in a sense, of understanding what is encompassed within this individual attribute. So if you create value but you don't distribute it, that is going to have an impact on the profitability and competitiveness of those parts of the food supply chain that are not getting what might be defined as their fair share of value added. And that in turn is related to the governance mechanisms that are inherent within particular food supply chains. And then you get the notion of fair trade, which is, if you like, an alternative governance mechanism, which is seeking to redistribute value in a particular way within food supply chains. Similarly, it's important to look at labour relations. If you think about picking vegetables, if I think from the UK context, a lot of vegetables are cut and harvested by people working as black labour for poor pay and very poor conditions, for example. And it's also important in terms of the contribution to economic development. If, again, the value is being extracted, and in many of the reports it comes out that the key players within food supply chains in terms of value, it's not any great news, but is at the retail end of the food supply chain. They tend to extract a disproportionate amount of value from most food supply chains. I do have another one here, but in light of the time constraints that we have, I'll move on really to just provide some almost sort of conclusive or reflective comments on what this approach has enabled or what it has involved critically. So a key component of it is the inclusion of a wide range of perspectives. So we're looking to have individual consumers to feed into this process, individual retailers to feed into this process, and the other 3 papers will talk about that a little bit more, about what that involved in practice. And the importance of understanding where these narrative contexts are coming from, who's saying them, why are they saying them, to what extent might they be influenced by the culture within which they sit, and how does that help to develop particular communications discourses. And ultimately, through the matrix, through the identification of these 24 attributes, so we're endeavoring to capture everything in 24 words or phrases, if you like. It allows us to attempt at least to align multiple meanings and to develop some kind of common understanding. It's not to say that I'm sure you here would have some issues with particular attributes. Why did you include this one? Why didn't you include something else? But essentially it's a way of constraining or bringing together the debate. Also critically, we have sought to move on from simplistic global-local distinctions. It's not to say we're denying it, and in some cases it's quite a stark distinction, but we don't want, and we haven't within Glamur, sought to, if you like, cut the project into two. This is local, that is global. There is clearly hybridity between the two chains in a lot of different ways. Critically too, this idea of taking a multi-dimensional perspective. So we're looking at the economic and the environmental and the social and the health and the ethical and so on. And each are understood to be very important. And by basing this on post-normal science, that has provided a useful frame for us. So this multi-dimensional approach helps to overcome what has been described as hypercognition, which I think is a terrible term, but basically means blinkered vision, not just solely focusing on climate change or on carbon reduction, but looking much more broadly than that, opening up the visibility fields to see truly what is being talked about in a lot of different places. You're then able to get a more relational view. You've got these different views, which one is more important against this particular agenda that is being followed with this particular food supply chain. So as I heralded at the beginning, a key aim has been to try and develop a methodology that enables the democratization of our understandings of sustainability and performance within food supply chains, and to more widely legitimize, so give credence, give value to different perspectives, not just say, oh, they're simply consumers, what do they know, for example. So I'll come back on the concluding slide just to reorientate you again, to say that what I've been talking about is the socioeconomic context, looking at discourses, and from those discourses identifying 24 attributes. These 24 attributes were then examined within the individual case studies, and a range of indicators developed to examine those particular indicators through a number of different methods. And then ultimately, as I say, the decision-making tools, the behavior-altering tools, perhaps, will be discussed within the interactive workshop at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Can you switch off the mic? Thank you. Thank you, James. I now give the floor to Kees. I just want to recall that at the end of the presentations, we will have a Q&A session. So please interact with us, because we are really interested in receiving your feedback, comments, and to discuss all these elements with you. So Kees, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Luca. I'm Kees de Roest from the Research Center for Animal Production in Reggio Emilia in Italy. And I will present then the results of the supply chain analysis we have done on 3+3 supply chains. So not two pairs of pairs, but we are trios, two trios in this case, of pig meat, based on pig meat in the Netherlands and in Italy. And the project has been carried out together with Giovanni Belletti from the University of Florence, Filippo Arfini and Davide Menozzi from the University of Parma, Henk Oost-Indië, Rudolf von Broekhuizen from Wageningen University, and Karin Rauhor of the Center for Environmental Research in the Netherlands. So it's a group of institutes which have done this study, and you will find the reports on the website. In this presentation, I will only, of course, reflect on the main results and the outcomes. And the presentation is as follows. It will be first a brief description now of the supply chains, what we are talking about, the local and the global pork change we have analyzed. Then we will go to the attributes and the indicators, like James was already mentioning. We have applied the indicators to these 6 supply chains, and then I will present you the results of this analysis. And in the end, there will be some time for discussion and conclusions. Well, as James already indicated, we have selected a series of attributes from the spheres and of the dimensions, which he already has explained quite well. And we have selected a few of attributes, because of course it would not be possible to analyze all attributes at the same time. And together with the stakeholders of the supply chains with which we have worked together, we selected the following attributes, and this is in this slide. And primarily they are in the dimension of economic and environmental dimension. So we did not touch health dimension or the social dimension. We focused on the economic and environmental dimension. The work has been particularly focused on the creation of added value. So the question has been posed, do local or regional chains create more value added perhaps than global chains or not? The other attribute we have analyzed is resilience, to which extent the chains are more or less resilient on the market. Governance is the third attribute we analyzed. How are the chains governed? Are their structures able to govern well the chains in order to create perhaps more value added, which is one of the questions we posed. And then we analyzed the environmental performance of these chains by means of a life cycle assessment. And the life cycle assessment we have carried out touched 5 particular impacts: carbon footprint, water footprint, land use, eutrophication, and energy use. So by means of data collection in the 6 chains, in particular on the 3 value chains in Italy, but also the 3 in the Netherlands. So which value chains we have analyzed? There are 3 in Italy. The first is the global chain of generic cured ham in Italy. The second is the regional chain of Parma ham, the well-known Parma ham, of course, and then Cinta Senese, which is a local chain in Tuscany, based on the local breed of Cinta Senese pigs. And in the Netherlands, also there we had 3 global and local chains. So Vion, which is a global chain, which is based on the large-scale multinational company Vion. KDV is a sustainable pig chain in the Netherlands, which represents 1.5 million pigs, which is a deliberate choice to relocalize pig production. And then the third is the Lupine chain, which is of a small farmer, which even more local, which is an initiative based on local feed and based on an attempt to produce higher quality and better taste with local feed. So these are the 6 chains. Briefly, they are described in these graphs, and I will not go into the details of it, but you can see, of course, we start with the pigs, then here, and we have the hams, and they are dried, and then at the end they are sold. The Parma ham chain and the generic cured ham chains are similar. The only thing, the big difference between the two is that the Parma ham, at least the pigs have to live for 9 months, and those who are producing cured hams, the generic cured hams, only for 6 months. But also there are others, because Parma ham is a well-known PDO product, so there is a whole product specification behind it, which differentiates Parma ham from the generic cured ham, which is, of course, important distinction. Even more local is the local chain of the Cinta Senese, and here we show the slide, which is as you notice here, the Cinta Senese is a local breed, and you see it on the picture. And from this breed, very local products are being produced, among which also Cinta Senese ham. The Dutch chains, well, three chains are Vion, a global pork chain based on standard pig production. The sustainable pork chain KDV, which is a farmers-led relocalization concept and deliberately is distanciating from the global chain in the sense that these farmers deliberately set up a production specification to enhance animal welfare and environmental sustainability. And then the lupine pork, which is a farmer-led initiative to recreate distinctive pork quality. One of the things we noticed at the beginning already is that global and local, as James was already indicating, is rather not very simplistic to analyze. Global and local are intermingled. So in this case, we show here, for example, the Cinta Senese ham, which also have local and have mostly local inputs, but also national inputs, and they will sell primarily locally to local restaurants and in Tuscany, but they will also export some of their products. So local and global, to some extent, is rather intermingled. This chain, anyhow, is very local, the Cinta Senese ham. But if we look at the Parma ham chain, oh, sorry, I just have to go back to, there are some which are missing, but that's strange. But anyhow, this is the generic cured ham. There you notice it, which is very global, where you notice that they source their feed from international markets, and then it's being produced locally, but then the cured ham, the generic cured ham, is sold on all export market and in the national Italian market. The value added at pig farms. We analyzed, this is the first attribute which we analyzed, and the interesting point here is that the value added of the Italian PDO pigs, the regional chain, is able to create per kilogram of meat more value added than the global chain. So here we have really have an evidence of the fact that the global chain, of the local chain, is able to create more value added to remunerate labor and capital in the chain. And the same is happening also at the cured ham level. Generic cured ham, for example, does create less value added per kilogram with respect to Parma ham. Parma ham is able, per kilogram of ham, able to produce more value added because of its distinctive quality with respect to generic cured ham. Another attribute is resilience, and also here in this graph, I don't have time to analyze all the indicators. There are several indicators indicated in this network graph, but the conclusion is that the local and the regional chains perform better than the global chains in terms of resilience. And then the question is why? And one of the answers is, to our opinion, the capacity of local and regional chains, or the more local chains with respect to the global chains, to have a better performance, a better governance of the chain. So they have structures to govern better the chain, and to mobilize institutional support, to create, maintain, increase the distinctiveness with respect to the global chain, and to protect also local producers from unfair competitors. Then we have a look at the carbon footprint, and we have analyzed this point very in detail. This is indicating the CO2 equivalent emission for the different chains per kilogram of pig carcass, and here we see that the Dutch chains have a lower CO2 emission, so less greenhouse gases per kilogram of carcass, and whereas the Italian chains, ham chains, do have more, and simply one of the main reasons is that they live longer, 9 months at least, so they have a worse environmental impact in terms of greenhouse gases than the lighter pigs, which live only for 6 months. And that's one of the reasons. It's also due to the production system differences, but the main is the longer life of the animals, which is creating a worse carbon footprint for the Italian pigs. If we look at the water footprint, we notice that the local chains have a better water footprint. They use less water per kilogram carcass with respect to the global chains. So here again, all the global chains in the Netherlands, sorry, and the Italian chains have global chains have a worse water footprint. And I would like to stress that the water consumption is in particular taking place at the farm level. We will look at afterwards as well, and for the production of feed in particular. And then we have also the land use, and that land use is worse for the Cinta Senese, and here we have reflected a lot on this result, because the Cinta Senese pigs are using forests which in a life cycle assessment would be indicated as negative, but we would consider this as also a positive effect. Although using lower land use, they are losing land which otherwise would have been abandoned or would not have been used. So here we also see the limits of livestock assessment. If we just see how much land they use, you can conclude, oh, this is worse. But in this case, we're talking about land which otherwise would have been abandoned and not used for other purposes. In this slide then, which we show the different impacts for the cured hams in Italy, and in the blue, indicated in blue, is the livestock phase, and here you immediately see that the farm level is where we have the highest environmental impact. At slaughter level, it's much less. That's the red line, and in green we have the seasoning period, and there we have, in particular, for energy use, for example, for Parma ham in particular, for example, the long period of seasoning is demanding a lot of energy. So there we have a worse carbon footprint for ham, in particular, with respect to the generic cured ham, which has a shorter seasoning period. One of the issues we have analyzed is also the interaction. And as I said already before, it's already difficult to define exactly what is local and global, because sometimes local chains source also globally and sell locally, but have also export markets. But another point is that the chains are also influencing themselves. So the producers of Parma ham produce also generic cured ham at the same time. So they are operating on two markets, on the global market and on the regional market of Parma ham. The same is happening, for example, between the Dutch chains of the regional sustainable chains with respect to the global chains. They distantiate from the global, but they have a lot of aspects in common with the global chain as well. So to finalize this presentation, I have 2 slides still, and that's the one is dedicated to discussion. The first point is that the selected attributes we seem to be appropriate to compare the local and global chains. And then we noticed that although the local chains are more resilient, within the chain, although we noticed that the resilience is obtained by transferring risk and losses to the weakest part of the chain, which are the pig farmers. So there is a kind of attempt of the actors in the downstream in the chains to transfer risk to the lower level, up down to the pig farms. And although the chain in itself is more resilient than the local chains in particular, there is risk also to transfer the risk to the pig farmers. Then local and global chains interact at different levels, as we have seen. In particular, the Parma and the generic ham are interacting very much between themselves. And also the KDV, so the sustainable pig chain in the Netherlands, are interacting with the other chains. Although it's important to notice that both are relocalization attempts. So they're deliberately were going out of the global chain in order to be more distinctive and to relocalize their chains, and to in this way make an effort to have more value added. Parma ham enterprises try also even to enter in the Cinta Senese ham chain. So there we have also interaction between Parma ham and the Cinta Senese ham. So there we have also companies which are even working on two markets, of the local market and then the regional market of Parma ham. Then at the end I would like to list the main conclusions, or one of the main conclusions. In this study, there is evidence that local food chains are able to generate more added value and to be more resilient, and thanks in particular to the governance structure they are able to manage, and they by means of the chain governance they are able to generate more value added and to be more resilient than global chains. A key to achieve these results exactly is the use to self-governance mechanisms like product distinctiveness, institutional support from local bodies. They are able to mobilize local support, collaborative relationships among economic agents, and their ability to protect against unfair protection, in particular through the PDO labels they are involved in. And of course, Regulation 1151 enforces this, the ability for these chains to be more distinctive and strengthen the link with the territory. So, but the extra value added we have seen and the resilience are not to be considered for granted. It's the result of the complex strategies of the local economic agents in the chains. And with this last conclusion, I would like to conclude my presentation dedicated to these 6 pork chains. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kees. I will now give the floor to Emilia Schmidt. As already stated, Glamur worked on 7 value chains. We decided to present here today 3 of them. We remain in the livestock sector and go through the dairy sector, comparing cheese in 2 countries at local and global productions in Switzerland and UK. Thank you, Emilia.
Thank you. So I'm Emilia Schmidt from the FIBEL, the Research Institute for Organic Agriculture in Switzerland. And I worked on the cheese cases with my colleagues from the CCRI in the UK who are also here today. So what we did in comparing these cheeses is applying the framework that was already presented, looking at these 5 dimensions of sustainability. To decide on which cases we were going to study, we based ourselves on the 4 criteria of distinction that were given in the project. We looked, for example, at distance along the value chains, the governance structure, whether it was more governed by local actors or global actors, the type of resources, knowledge, know-how that's applied for the production and the value chain, and the identity of the product. So with these criteria, we were able to find case studies in Switzerland. First, we have Le Gruyère cheese, which is a hard cheese, the most produced in the country. As a local example, we have Letiva. And in the UK, 3 cheeses were found, the cheddar as a global example, and then Farmhouse cheddar as a more local cheese, as well as single Gloucester cheese. So in more detail, this is the value chain for Le Gruyère cheese in Switzerland. you have more than 2,000 dairy producers in the French-speaking part of Switzerland mainly, and they deliver the milk twice a day to creameries that are located in the villages, around 200 creameries. The third step of the value chain is then to mature the cheese for several months in very big cellars. And then the cheese is distributed in Switzerland, Europe, and the whole world. Around 50% is exported. However, the production of the Gruyère cheese is under a PDO, and this means that the production can occur only in this region of southwest Switzerland. So this is where the milk production, the cheese making, and the maturing of the cheese until 4 months happens. But then it can be exported everywhere. The local cheese in Switzerland, it's the Letiva cheese, and here the difference is that it's made by the dairy producers themselves on the Alp. You have around 70 families who produce the milk and the cheese themselves on wood fire. They are grouped in a cooperative, and they manage the maturing of the cheese themselves in the village of Letiva, where they mature it themselves, and then they sell it either on the chalet locally there, but it is also distributed in the whole of Switzerland, and around 30% is exported. It's also under PDO, so it means it can be produced only in this very small region, that's 10 villages in the Alps of Switzerland. So in the UK, here you see the value chain for the more global cheese, the cheddar, which supplies milk from local and regional suppliers, and then process the cheese making in rather large creameries. And then it follows a classical way until it's sold by retailers, mainly in supermarkets and also for export. The two local cheeses in the UK follow a path that's more similar to the Etiva. So producers have their own herds. For example, for the Gloucester cheese, it has to be a part of Gloucester cows. The farmers make the cheese themselves in the farmhouse, mature it themselves as well, and then they sell it either via direct sales on the farm or on local markets and via special retailers as well. So when we looked at these cases, even before starting comparing them, but just by exploring the cases at the beginning, we realized that the main distinction between these local and global dimensions is actually the farmhouse creamery distinction. So it means that local cheeses are mostly produced by the farmers themselves, and the global cheeses are mostly produced by big creameries who buy the milk from milk suppliers. So that was the key distinction, but we could also distinguish them by volumes, distance, the part exported, etc. We also realized that they are all along a continuum between the local and global. So you have some small creameries that are close to local, but you also have some farmhouses that go a bit into the global market. So it's very much on a continuum. There is also a level of hybridity. So for example, some Gruyère producers in Switzerland also sell the cheese themselves sometimes. So you have some direct sales. And also what's important is that all of the local producers also buy inputs from global markets. So for example, they will buy rennet, that's the enzyme you need to coagulate the cheese, on the global market. Or the dairy farmers, they would buy feed for the cows on the global market as well, although they produce locally afterwards. But we can still say that the most local cheese in our examples are the UK local cheeses, the single Gloucester and the farmhouse cheddar. Afterwards, they will be combined together as the farmhouse UK cheese. Then comes Letiva in Switzerland, and the two most global cheeses are first Le Gruyère and then the cheddar, the industrial cheddar. So after that, we started comparing these cheeses using indicators, and the beginning of the method is what James was describing earlier, how we went from 5 dimensions to the attributes, and then we selected indicators to measure these attributes. The final step is to score these attributes and indicators. So we had to collect the data on the value chains, and for that we went to the farms, to the cheese-making factories, and conducted interviews to collect data. And then, when you have the data, we looked at a scale of performance. So for example, we looked at animal welfare, and we measured grazing time. So how many hours per year a cow can spend outside. And then we constituted a grid to say this is a performance between 0 and 100%. So all indicators can be measured on a percentage scale, and then you can easily compare them. So this is the list of attributes and indicators that we used. I will not describe now each of them, but you will see them in the results. We had 8 attributes. So for example, in the economic dimension, we looked at affordability and creation and distribution of added value. For the social part, we looked at information and communication, both within the value chain and with the consumers. We looked as well at consumer behavior with focus groups. On the health dimension, we looked at nutrition, especially fat and salt content. For the ethics, we looked at animal welfare. And then for the environmental dimensions, there was resource use and biodiversity, mainly. Okay, so what are the results? First, so you see on these graphs, the red columns are for the Swiss cheese and the blue ones for the UK cheese. The lighter color is for the local cheese and the darker one for the global cheese. So this is the performance on a percentage scale. So what you can realize here, for example, is that for the indicator contribution to the economy of the region, we looked here at how many jobs are created in the value chains. Here, clearly, the local cheeses provide more jobs per ton of cheese produced. So it's related to the quantity of cheese produced. But we realized that one of the main differences here is that local cheeses rely much more on physical workforce rather than mechanized work. And on the other side, the global cheeses are better able to provide the cheese at an affordable price. So because they are more mechanized and operate at bigger scales, the cheese is cheaper in the end. Regarding the perception of consumers, we saw here that the difference is more between the countries, because Swiss consumers think that for the quality it is, the cheese has a good price, where in the UK, they were a bit less ready to pay that much. For the social indicators, we saw, for example, that the communication within the value chain was better in the local examples. So it's also because the chains are shorter and they have a cooperative, for example, in Switzerland, they are better able to communicate efficiently between the actors. However, concerning the availability of information, the performance was higher in Switzerland compared to the UK. And we saw that the global cheese has a higher tendency to have lots of information on the product label itself. So this is mainly because they rely more on supermarkets to sell the cheese, so they have to put all the information on the label. But the local cheese, they sell more directly, so you have more direct contact between the producer and the consumer, and the information is also communicated orally directly. In the environmental dimension, here we saw that local chains have better practices concerning the soil management. We also saw that in Switzerland there is a higher diversity of production on the farm, so they also produce other things next to the dairy. And in the 3 other indicators, there was a much higher performance in the UK, but here I have to say that the indicators were a little bit different, and especially the number of data was a bit different, so this is to be taken carefully. In the health dimension, here the performance was higher in Switzerland concerning the salt content and the fat types. So we looked at the difference between saturated and unsaturated fats, and also concerning the higher calcium content. So the Swiss cheeses are a bit healthier, if we can say. But the fat content in percentage was higher, was better in the local cheeses. So the fat content is actually lower. The last dimension concerned animal welfare. And here it was clear as well that farmers in the local chains kept the cows for a longer time, so they can live longer. They also have more space. And usually they also spent more time grazing. Okay, so after all these results, we can say that generally the local cheeses get a higher performance, or rather there is more indicators where the performance is higher in the local chains than in the global chains. But the difference between countries is also very important because you have different contexts, and this influences the performance greatly. So it's not only a question of local global, but it's in which country you are that will define your performance. In this study, we also had sometimes large differences in sample data availability, and so on, that made the analysis also difficult sometimes. But I have to say that the application of this methodology was really useful, because we didn't have only the quantitative results of each indicator, but we also had a qualitative aspect that we analyzed the context. We really went to see the actors, so you have all this information that can help you identify trade-offs and issues that are behind these indicators. And this list shows you what are the main points that we see as issues for sustainability in the cheese sector. So there is a trade-off between the quality of your cheese, so the fats, the salt, and the taste, with the prices you want to apply. There is also a trade-off or an issue going around geography and topography. So this influences how many cows you can have per hectare, for example, and which agricultural practices farmers can put in place. Subsidies also play an important role in which practices they put in place. And then you have all this issue about PDOs, so governance, and how the communication along the chain is regulated. And one last point is which level of employment you're going to have and which working conditions you can offer in exchange for production efficiency. So do you mechanize more, or do you have more workforce? This is also linked to the local-global distinction. So to conclude, the first point is that we really saw in the cheese sector that you have this continuum between local and global. It's quite hard to distinguish. It's not black and white, but it's always a bit in between. This selection of attributes was really useful to keep a holistic view, so we didn't focus just on the environment, but we really tried to see each of the dimensions. And then, because you have this broad view, it's really difficult to say, okay, this is more sustainable. No, it depends. Some have stronger performance in one dimension or another. So it's all trade-offs in the end. And this method is especially useful to identify these trade-offs. And I would say, to conclude, that to observe the whole value chain is really essential to analyze the sustainability, but it is challenging. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilia. And now I'll pass the floor to Francesca Galli. She will introduce the bread chains, not only local and global, but also an intermediate value chain in both countries, Italy and UK. Francesca, you have the floor.
Thank you, Luca. I'm really honored to be here on behalf of the FIRAB team and the City University team based in the UK. And I will give an overview of the wheat to bread sustainability assessment in Italy and the UK. Why bread? Not only because bread is a staple product which is very important in many cultures all around the world, but also we're witnessing two main trends. First of all, an increasing awareness or concern for the impacts on health and nutrition on the consumption of bread. And secondly, because there are many rising initiatives around the rethinking of the wheat to bread supply chains in terms of relationships and product quality features. In this work, we dealt with these questions. First of all, what can we learn from this comparative assessment of wheat to bread supply chains in two different countries, and what are the cross-cutting issues? And can sustainability performance be actually assessed in bread chains along the global-local continuum? As previously said by Emilia, we base the choice of our case studies around 4 criteria. First of all, a geographical distance. You know that wheat is a commodity traded all around the world, and it requires a double processing to be turned into first flour, then into bread. And governance. There is a mix of actors along each step of the chain, which sees a prevalence of local or global actors. Just one information about the two countries. In the UK, 90% of the market is led by 3 major players, industrialized and very large scale, while in Italy, 90% of the market is led by small-scale artisanal bakeries. The other 2 criteria are resources and know-how. The bread processing can be done according to continuous processes or discontinuous, and industrial-based processes see usually a larger number of ingredients in the recipe, while a smaller number of ingredients is usually used for craft bakery. And last, a very standard commodity such as wheat can yield a very standard bread or a very diversified product according to cultures and local traditions. So we did our cross-country comparison based on following the same set of guidelines. We adopted a participatory approach to account for the views and the opinions expressed by the different stakeholders along the different chains. And we integrated interviews with experts and the stakeholders, and we organized on-purpose workshop together with the study of scientific literature and grey literature to understand what the most relevant attributes to discriminate between local and global were. And then, together with the UK team, we agreed on a set of indicators for each attribute, and we also tried to assess the relative importance of each attribute according to the stakeholders. The chains that we selected at the global level are, for Italy, the Pan Bauletto supply chain produced by the Barilla company. It is a white, sliced and prepackaged bread, for which wheat is sourced mainly at the continental level and bread is sold within national borders. In UK, the bread was, again, a sliced bread produced by one of the 3 dominant highly industrialized plant bakers. The wheat is sourced from all over the world, and bread is sold nationally. The local case studies are in Italy, bread produced by the Stone Mill farm in the province of Pisa. The supply chain takes entirely place on farm. It is an organic farm which has built the facilities for milling and baking and sells the product directly or through very direct means such as internet and the local shops in the area. In the UK, the local bread is produced in the rural region of East Anglia by a family-owned craft bakery which uses local organic flour and flour from a mill in the region, but still it must integrate with 3% of flour from Canada for technological purposes. We also decided to focus on intermediate cases in both countries. And in Italy, we chose the Tuscan bread sourdough supply chain. This is a supply chain project fund under the supported by the Rural Development Program. and it is also undergoing the recognition of the protected designation of origin. So it is produced with wheat grown within Tuscany borders exclusively. In the UK, the regional chain is an in-store bakery, part of a major UK supermarket chain, which promotes British food and farming, so uses regionally sourced wheat and produces bread from scratch in 480 stores. These are the 6 attributes that we chose to focus on: nutrition, resource use and pollution, information, value added, technological innovation, and biodiversity. And these are the indicators that we selected for each attribute across the 5 dimensions. Within the red box are the indicators that were, in the end, comparable across the 2 teams. These are the results. You can see that overall the 2 local cases outperform the other chains across the 2 countries. Similar profiles across the local cases and the global cases, with some small differences. Major differences were found in the regional cases at the bottom of the slide, because in Italy the regional supply chains shares more features closely related to the local chain, while in the UK it's the opposite. It is more embedded in the industrial chain. This slide shows the results of the workshop that we organized with the stakeholders. The purpose of the workshop was to compare the assessment we carried out through the indicators with what the stakeholders, and we also invited other actors beyond the ones included in the 3 chains. We asked them to express their perception on the performance of our 3 chains, to see and compare our results. And the results are actually quite coherent, with some exceptions. For example, the global chains are expected to pollute more than what they actually do based on life cycle analysis indicators that we had available for the global and the local cases. And similarly, the global chain is expected to innovate less. Innovation intended in terms of efforts towards innovating towards non-commercial purposes, that is, environmental behaviors. Some reflections on the cross-cutting issues that we observed across the cases, again, and to reinforce the point that the boundaries between local and global chains are very fuzzy, not last because of the use of inputs that are often global, and the interconnections that there are among the chains. Second, the transparency attribute, intended as a correspondence between what is declared and what is actually delivered by the supply chain, is prioritized by all stakeholders across local and global chains. But we also realize that transparency has very different implications when the scale is larger. And we also observed rebalancing processes of global chains moving towards local chains and vice versa. In this regard, the regional chains seem to be a good scale for becoming a laboratory for innovation. There are still some unresolved trade-offs between the attributes. For example, how to deal with delivering biodiversity and maximizing productive output. Sustainable intensification is a possible solution, but it's not the only one. It's highly debated. Second, how to adapt the technological processes to enhance the nutritional quality of bread. In the words of the local Italian producer, the local chain is flexible enough to adapt the production process to preserve raw materials and the nutritional value of the product. But also global chains can innovate and can deliver a local feel with global characteristics. And last, a critical point is how to measure environmental performance, which seems to be, in our cases, inversely correlated to scale. And LCA remains a predominant metric, like it or not. Concluding remarks, 3 thoughts. First of all, sustainability assessment is relative in the sense that it must account for the different context in which it takes place. In the words of the global stakeholder, different products carry different promises by their respective supply chains, and they need to be assessed compared to the promise that they make. Second, that sustainability is a moving target. You never reach sustainability once and for all. And this quotation from an interview with a regional UK stakeholder said, consumers have little idea about what goes on into a loaf of bread, and the current climate means that cost is the major concern. Maybe 5 years ago, carbon footprinting concerned them. Now the focus is on health and food waste and shopping more regularly for less. And the last point, that sustainability self-assessment is useful, and we realize that speaking to stakeholders both in the local and the global chains, because you can't really manage what you can't measure. To conclude, I wanted to show you this picture, which is an allegory of the good government. This dates back to the 14th century. It is painted in the rooms of the municipality of Siena, and it represents the effects on the countryside of a good government. And in my last reflection, it shows really how sustainability is multidimensional, but at the same time a unitary concept, and that the dimension in which it can be unpacked all really derive from an ethical decision which comes first. But this is an invitation for steering the debate in the next section. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Francesca. So we are now in a we are about to open the discussion, the debate. As you have heard many times, we use the participatory approach, and we establish a dialogue with stakeholders, value chain actors. And so this is a very relevant part for the Glamur project. We really wanted to engage this dialogue in order to discuss our approach, discuss the results, validate these results with the key stakeholders that not only have a voice on this, but also have an idea on the value chains they are working on. So this is a very valuable moment for us also to get a feeling, get your feedback about your impressions. First of all, the floor is yours for Q&A, so questions, considerations, remarks from you. I will now pass the floor to Damien, who will moderate this session. I just want to highlight one thing. You've heard several times the word but. I want to hear your buts. I mean, I want to hear the trade-offs you see in this project and in the way we conducted the project. So I will now pass the floor to Damien and to probably add some considerations. Thank you.
Thanks, Luca. Well, I mean, I won't say too much more, really, because I think you've had a lot of information thrown at you in the 4 talks that we've just had. James's talk introducing the overall Glamur approach, and then our 3 sort of supply chain narratives. So, I mean, I think basically we've got about 45 minutes. We have prepared some of our own questions, but I think I'd like to start by just opening up the floor and maybe inviting comments, reactions, observations to what you've heard in the 4 talks. Are there sort of key issues or questions that you'd like to sort of raise, really? And maybe we start like that and let's see how it goes, and if need be, we can return to our own formalized questions. But I think really it's your opportunity to ask questions and points of clarification, etc. So should we start with that? Can I just ask people who ask a question or something just to briefly introduce yourself and your institution, and let's open the floor and see what people have got to say.
There is a microphone available, and since I know some of the persons as you realize, the event is in English, but in case you are in desperate need to say something in Italian, I will be happy to translate it. Please be short in case. So the floor is yours.
So do people have any comments? Yes?
Hi, thank you. Just a question: how did you decide how did you choose the country? The country. So why Italy and UK and not why Italy versus France? So which are the reasons behind the choices of the pairs?
Okay, Amelia, you were involved in that aspect of the work. Do you want to address that question, or is that okay? Or
I was not much involved in that process, actually. I think that was at the very beginning of the project, looking at who in the research team already had some knowledge in some of the sectors involved, and then pairing, like, we did a lot of preliminary work describing some cases we thought we could apply the framework to, and then some didn't work out because stakeholders didn't want to work with us. So we had to then select the cases on which we could really work and pair countries like this. Some original pairs didn't work in the end, and that's the final choice.
yeah, it was fairly inductive, I think, in the sense that partners were encouraged to think about what might be interesting commodity sectors, and then pairs were kind of developed that way. Kees, do you want to make a comment?
Perhaps the reason of comparing the Netherlands with Italy for pork, one of the reasons I think was that there is in the Netherlands, for example, quite a lot of interest in the Italian pork chains in their ability to create more value added, for example, to pig meat. As in the Netherlands, the model of production of pigs is very industrialized, industrial pig production, and they're struggling a lot with the low prices they have. So the reason of comparing the Dutch and the Italian was in particular to see if there are possibilities also in the Netherlands, for example, to create more value added through alternative local chains, and to see also what the mechanisms are in the Italian pork chains, their ability to govern the chain, for example, and in this way to create more value added. That's the reason why the Netherlands and Italy have been compared.
Sorry, I keep turning this on and off, but it's probably worth saying, it may not have come across, but there's different methodologies that have been applied across different case studies. So we had something called a kind of participatory checklist, which is a more sort of qualitative approach, but we also had life cycle analysis, shadow pricing was another methodology, metabolic analysis. So some of the members of the research project have got a lot of experience of applying those methodologies to certain sectors. So in a sense, there was an element of that as well, so that we were sort of developing pairs of pairs who had expertise in terms of applying these different methodologies as well. So, but thanks for that question, it's a good one. Do we have any more questions or comments? Yes?
Parlo in italiano. Per le farine 00 che sono purificate e quindi possono creare dei problemi alla salute come, non so, la celiachia o malattie di questo genere, cioè una relazione tra l'utilizzo delle farine molto purificate e eventuale diffusione di malattie che sono connesse con questa, cioè se avete indagato anche su questi aspetti che sono molto importanti secondo me.
Yeah, I will quickly translate the question, and then I will probably pass the mic to Francesca. The question is if the Glamur project, in particular the assessment on the bread chain, has investigated the implications on health of the double O flour, and in particular in relation to the celiac disease.
Yeah, we addressed the nutrition or health dimension, and it was very interesting because it was really hard to find good indicators. not only across the two countries, but in absolute terms, because the consumption of bread usually happens together with other foods, and then you have to understand the diet to see what really the impacts are. But we have spent some time reflecting on these issues, and we realized how the practices for nutritional purposes change in local, regional, and global chains, of course, the ones that we could observe. And what came up was that local and regional chains are situations where it's easier to experiment with and using different technologies. For example, the milling technology or the stone milling that allows to preserve the germ into the flour and the outer layers of the kernel, which confer the nutritional properties to the flour. And the regional chain for Tuscany explicitly bases the marketing strategy on the nutritional value of the flour used, which is white, but with the germ inside. And this requires some changes from the organizational technological point of view for the firms that are involved. First of all, because you have to be able to trace the wheat and preserve the identity of wheat flour until the bread, so that the consumer is able to know what's the difference between that flour and other flours. And also because the flour that contains the germ has a very much shorter shelf life, so it needs to be preserved in a particular way. So at the smaller scale, it's easier to readapt the production process, and the smaller supply chains, more integrated chains, favor this.
Is that okay? Do you want a response? Are you okay? Okay. So do we have any other comments or questions? Yes?
Thank you for all this information. The model is very, very useful, and I think it's really interesting for analyzing food policy performance. But what about policies? Have you studied the impact of local and national policies and the regulatory system on local food system performances? Isn't there a better policy for a better local food system? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments and very good questions. So would anyone like to take that one on? Kees, you want to have a go?
Well, yeah, a first comment on this question might be, I think that important for local change is the quality policy of the EU, I think, and that this is valid for all the chains we have analyzed this morning. The opportunity for local chains, if they are rooting their quality in the local natural and human characteristics of the territory and link the quality to the territory, the PDO labeling, of course, is a tool, can be a powerful tool to be used by local chains. And that, I think, is valid for all the chains we have heard this morning. It gives even more strengther power to local chains when they have tools to fight against unfair competition. In time, in the last 20 years, the regulation has been renewed several times and have given strengther tools to the local chain producers to fight against unfair competition. Like, for example, the ex-official possibility to denounce producers when they imitate the local products. I would say that that's one of the main policy tools the local chains, I think, can use. There are others, of course, as well. Perhaps the others can contribute as well, of course.
Yeah. Do people want to? I mean, certainly, I think we've certainly talked about the quality policies quite a lot, and I think to go back to an earlier comment, one of the quite interesting things about the pairs of pairs analysis is looking at the different way that member states conceptualize what is meant by that policy and how they kind of operationalize it. So, for example, it's been quite interesting from our perspective, which is a sort of UK perspective, looking at how Switzerland apply the kind of PDO policy and the kind of the way that they organize, or if you like, the way that they kind of govern their supply chains is very interesting. And you can get quite a lot of, I think, learning across states in terms of how different member states apply quality policies. I mean, in the UK, basically, I don't think we quite get it, to be honest with you, if you look at how it's implemented in somewhere like Switzerland. So I think the quality policies are certainly a key one, but there would be lots of others. I mean, there is a separate work package which we haven't talked about today, which is all around policy, which has been led by our colleagues at City University. And one of the things that they're trying to do at the moment is to make sense of all of the data that we've got and see how that can be fitted into policy recommendations, not just in terms of quality policy, but also things like food safety and that sort of thing. And I guess one of the quite interesting things, again, it's kind of been hinted at in the discussions, is thinking about a differentiation between kind of purely global and purely local. So this idea that you have differences within global, for instance. So you'll have differentiated global supply chains. So Gruyere is very different to global bulk orange juice or something like that. You know, so there's some quite interesting learning to go on there, I think, about how we sort of drop down a level, if you like, in terms of the discussions about global local. But I'm probably talking too much. I'm supposed to be sharing. James, did you want to comment?
Got just a short point to make in that policies that might have been taken at a more global level or at a larger scale can have very direct impacts, obviously, at a local scale. And in the UK, one of our cheese producers used in our case study is about to go bust because of the removal of of milk quotas, for example, and the embargo on Russian exports and the deflationary pressures on milk prices. And he's situated midway between being very local and global, and he's fallen between all stools. He can't maximize the benefits of being a very localized cheese producer like the single Gloucester producers. There are only 6 people who make single Gloucester cheese in a total of 100 tons, so they have a very particular market. And although, of course, they are impacted upon by the policy decision to remove milk quotas, for example, they have ways of overcoming that, whereas the middle-sized person can't. He's in the middle and basically said that he can't adapt sufficiently to the lower prices, which the bigger players, the big creamery producers of cheddar, for example, are able to make use of sourcing their milk on the global market, whereas he struggles more.
Yeah, to complement what my colleague said, the Glamur project is asked, I would say, as usual, to deliver some final policy recommendations. So we are now in a very crucial phase of the project because we have entered the 3rd and last year of the project. So we are now debating what are the main messages we have to deliver. We are trying to fine-tune based on the findings and based on this kind of discussion with stakeholders, what can be the most suitable to the project and useful messages to deliver, also to policymakers, but not only to policymakers. So policymakers, the European Commission, of course, is very much interested in getting a policy feedback from the project, but we also want to deliver messages and information to the stakeholders, to the value chain actors, in order to better fulfill their role in the value chain. So we will discuss in the next project meeting in Barcelona next month these policy messages. So after this meeting, these messages will be, let's say, cosmetically prepared, and they will be delivered by the end of this year, latest January, because January is the last month of the Glamur project.
Sorry, yes?
My name is Josué De Salvo. I work for a development NGO called Manitese, an Italian one. And your last words, Luca, makes me more confused than before, because I was trying to go to the origin of this project, and two questions for you. The two questions were, what is the gap that you are trying to fill with this project in terms of in the field of research and in the field of decision making? And the other question is, if you had a common theory among partners at the beginning of the project, a common thesis, sorry, not theory, thesis, because it seems to me that most of you feel that the local production as a model of production more sustainable than the other, but then everything is relative, and it's the model of assessment is not giving a final answer. So when you say now the third year of the project, the final phase is to give policy recommendation. Are those recommendations related to policy decisions, or recommendation to which model of assessment decision making should apply? I mean, this is more or less you understand me. You know me, you can understand my feeling, my thoughts.
Well, no, some really interesting comments actually, and I think probably a series of questions which we might want to try and explain and take apart a bit. So, I mean, do people want to respond? I don't want to keep talking, but this first one about what's the gap that we're trying to fill. Does someone want to have a go at that one, James?
I can make a start. I think they are very good questions, very important questions. I think the gap that the starting point for the project is very much to try and broaden the scope of understanding the performance of food supply chains. So, as I said in my presentation, we're not just looking to see whether things are environmentally more sustainable or they're economically more sustainable. There's a recognition that you can't look at these things in isolation. And so a key part of what Glamur has been trying to do is to develop a way of encompassing these broad ranges of, and I think that, and I mentioned it as well, this notion of perspective. People's perspectives are very important. They don't have to just be scientifically proven issues in relation to, okay, you've got like Keys talking about how much CO2 or how many liters of water per kilogram of pork. Yes, that's important, but there's more to it than just that. You have to know what is the impact going to be on the local culture where they're growing that pork. What are the health benefits of that particular product? I mean, if you're growing a product or meat or grain or whatever it is, and it might be more sustainable in one dimension, it may be less sustainable on another dimension. So you have to look at the context. And I think that an important contribution that Glamur hopefully will make when it reaches policy circles is to enable people to encompass a broader range of issues before making decisions or before making policies to determine which supply chain to support or another.
And I think in relation to that as well, the original call which was put out by the Commission was a recognition that there was a gap in knowledge in terms of saying, well, we have a lot of rhetoric that suggests that global is better or local is better, but we don't have an evidence base to actually, substantiate that in a sense. So I think Glamur was filling that void very significantly. And we as sort of social scientists were conscious that it was always going to be a difficult thing to try and do because of the inherent complexity of supply chains. But I think the basic starting point was that there was a gap in knowledge in terms of evidence in relative performance differences between global and local, to be honest. And I think our starting thesis, was this idea of multidimensionality. That is the Glamur thesis to my mind. So, as James says, broadening out assessments which to date have predominantly focused particularly on the economic and environmental to try to account for these 5 dimensions. I think that was our starting point. And then taking that forward, our sort of theoretical idea, if you like, is this notion of a post-normal way of thinking about these things. So trying to reflect values and perceptions as well as, you know, the kind of standard scientific elements. I think they're our kind of basic framings. At least that would be my sort of interpretation of them anyway. I mean, can we take on this question that you raised, which I think, again, is a very interesting point. This idea that there's a kind of implicit kind of statement in a lot of the talks, and in fact it's presented that local production is the kind of model that we need to be favouring. Do people want to take on that question and maybe, you know, sort of take it apart a bit? Or are there attributes which would contest that thesis or whatever? Emilia?
So I will just talk about the Swiss cheese example. It was very difficult at the beginning to not choose a global product that would be really bad and then a local that's really perfect, because we didn't want to give the impression we really are in favor of local, because we wanted to remain scientific and really compare 2 products with indicators and be as objective as possible. And Le Gruyère cheese is one of the most successful products in Switzerland, and that's also why we chose it. It's working very well. It has a governance that is very successful. They increase their production every year. And that's why we chose it and not the Emmental cheese, for example. Because Emmental has some difficulties, and we thought if we choose it, we're going to show that it's not working so well at the global scale. So that's why we didn't pick that case study. But the Etiva cheese is working very well as well. So we had 2 very good products to compare, and we didn't know at the beginning, okay, which one is performing better. And I was really surprised myself to see, for example, that for all the nutrition indicators, the Etiva has a better performance. We didn't really expect it in the beginning, but it's the case.
Maybe I can add, drawing from the bread case study. We chose best practices, both at local, regional, and global level. And on one side, this responded to what Emilia was saying. So we're comparing the good ones, cases where there is an intention to improve sustainability, but at the same time, looking at local and global as extremes and choosing best practices leaves out an awful lot of gray area in the market. And I'm thinking this also in terms of policy, where there is no clear identity, other attributes would have become relevant. I'm thinking, for example, about waste. Recently in Italy, there was a big check on the safety of bread, and safety in our cases did not seem like a relevant attribute to discriminate. Or waste. Waste is a huge problem for bread, but it really did not come up as indicators through our own study and by confronting with the stakeholders. Because, so in this sense, I would say that comparing local and global brings a lot of richness to the discussion, but at the same time, it might also imply that it's not possible to see everything. So also, especially by using a case study approach.
Yeah, I think of interest in the study dedicated to the pork change was in particular, first of all, to come to the conclusion that it's like in the other chains as well, it's very difficult to distinguish sometimes between local and global because of the fact that local chains also source from input from global markets and etc. So the distinction, first of all, was not always very clear, and that's the first one. But more important, I think, was the to analyze the interaction between global and local chains. That global chains, for example, would imitate or take over some aspects of local chains in order to, to take over some aspects which the local chains already had promoted. And then the global chains, they take this over. An example is, for example, in the local Dutch chains, castration, for example, for piglets was immediately forbidden. Now the global chain is also looking at the possibility, well, perhaps we can do that as well. So this interaction between global and local is very interesting to see. And the same thing is happening between the generic cured ham and the Parma ham. You have producers of specialized Parma ham producers which do only Parma ham, and they have the opportunity to remunerate their labor good also when they are small scale, because the extra value added per kilogram is significantly higher than for generic. So there you have specialized producers, but you have also the big producers of Parma ham, which are at the same time producing generic cured ham. So they have both, they are on both markets. And to see the interaction between global and local in this, within the same company, for our research was very interesting to see how they act on two markets and try to have the benefits of both local and global at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's important to think in terms of trade-offs, and that was something that Amelia talked about in relation to cheese and also highlighted it in the graphs. For example, that you might get a lot of rural jobs per kilogram of cheese. So from a social point of view or a local employment point of view, that is a high performance. But in terms of the number of kilograms per labor unit in economic terms, it's a very poor performance. So it's a trade-off. It depends what is more important within that particular context. And I think that Glamur, through trying to create this idea of a common understanding so that people are aware of these trade-offs, and therefore when the policymaker is trying to make a decision, if they are aware of that, they can then more accurately or with a greater degree of understanding make their policy decisions. And I think that it's, you know, many of us would probably have come into the project or would instinctively say, yeah, local's better, I like it, I go to a farmer's market or the local market to buy local cheeses and so on. But if we compare local Gloucester, for example, which I buy from my local farmer's market, it's different every week. I mean, that's part of the charm, but if you want exactly the same product, then it's not performing very well. Whereas Le Gruyere, we went with Amelia to have a look at Gruyere, and you cut any cheese anywhere and it's identical. And that, on another, you know, another range of criteria, is performing much better.
I mean, particularly in the early part of the work, we looked in Senegal and Peru for how global and local there was perceived. And some of the data from there was really interesting because, in a sense, it was almost the counter kind of European, you know, kind of local idea that you would have. So in those contexts in particular, there was a very clear preference in many cases for global commodities, for, you know, for cultural reasons, for cooking, for all sorts of different things. They were perceived as actually being better for different reasons. So I think one of the things that we're quite keen not to do is to be seen to be trying to have a very kind of pro-local agenda. That's actually not what we're trying to do at all. I think this idea of socioeconomic context and locating how the performance of food chains, be it global or local, is talked about and framed is really important. So you do get these relative differences, and it depends on the situation. And you know, Peru is obviously very different to someone like the UK, and you know, so I think that is quite important. There was a final point you raised with regards to policy recommendations and what we're trying to do. Do people want to pick that up a bit? This idea of what we're attempting to do with our policy recommendations. I mean, I think, again, it's a shame our city colleagues aren't here, but we certainly will be making, I don't know sometimes if recommendations is the right word, but we'll certainly be reflecting on what we've learned and what that then means for particularly some key European level policies. So the quality policy is obviously going to be one, but we will, I think, also be making kind of broader comments about, you know, how we go forward in terms of this type of food chain assessment work and how we do sustainability assessment and those types of things. So we'll be making those kind of recommendations as well, in addition to specific ones.
So can I add briefly? So
Microphone.
just to understand better, let me use the word competitor. So what are the current competitors to this model, to this multidimensional model that you are proposing? I mean,
Yeah.
and so who is using it, and who can substitute the current model with this model that you are proposing, you are finalizing?
I mean, I could answer that, but do other members of the panel? I don't want to keep hogging the sort of floor. Do other people want to comment, or shall I just continue to ramble on aimlessly? Do you want to comment, Amelia?
So do you mean who is using this kind of assessment tools? From what I know, it's mostly in research at the moment, but also the FAO has proposed 2 years ago guidelines for the assessment of food system and agriculture. It's called the SAFA guidelines, and they also propose 4 dimensions of assessment with 200-something indicators that you can use, and they give guidelines how to measure them. But I wouldn't say they are competitors, because a lot of the work we did during this project was also based on what they propose. Yeah. So we are all working together to get in the end some kind of tool that you can use to assess sustainability. But one very important point that they also say, and that we realized in this project, is that you always have to adapt your assessment tool, your indicators, to your context. You will never be able to use the same indicators for cheese as for tomatoes. It's just not possible. So even if you have these common frameworks that are available, the FAO one, other ones, the Glamur one, you will always have to do this work of adapting to your case. So it's a method that's always case by case.
And also, one last comment, thinking about the workshop that we did with the stakeholders of the 3 chains. Thinking about the quality policy, the regional case is a PDO. There is a strong, for example, what the stakeholders being put together, so different among themselves. They were reflecting on for example, the nutritional value of the regional bread, but implying their environmental performance, while they're not actually assessing it. So a useful instrument is not only for policy, but also for stakeholders to obtain a checklist to carry out self-assessment by getting inspiration from chains of other sizes or other levels, such as the global ones for the regional.
James, did you want to?
I suppose in terms of, you phrase it in terms of who are the competitors for this approach. I mean, one of the competitors might be an exclusive focus on profit, for example. This is not exclusively about profit. Profit is one element. It's one dimension of the approach. So it's saying, it's not, are you familiar with the term race to the bottom? It's not about trying to buy all the ingredients as cheaply as you can in order to to have the product as cheap as you can get it at the end. It's more about trying to move the other way, if you like, going race to the top. How can we encompass these range of different dimensions? So it's quality, it is price, it is the environment, it is social, and so on. So it is changing the focus, and it's also putting a different slant on, yes, in these cases we have used indicators, but it has been a mixed method and multidisciplinary approach as far as possible. So it's trying to give more value, more legitimacy also to qualitative perceptions of performance and not simply quantitative assessments of performance. So I think whether they're competitors, but there are differences, there are subtleties, there are different foci that are being taken here. It's trying to broaden that.
I mean, there certainly is a very big industry around life cycle analysis and those kind of monodimensional kind of framings. So I think we would challenge those type of pieces of work, which kind of, you know, if your starting point is that the food chain is very complex, then to narrow it down to one dimension in a way is kind of missing the point. I mean, you're going to get a very specific measurement of performance, efficiency, sustainability, however you want to phrase it. So, I mean, we wouldn't probably be overly aggressive about it, but we would certainly say that we need to have a broader view of the performance of food chains. So I think that kind of industry around LCA in particular, we would probably we would probably position ourselves again, and maybe also the kind of sustainable intensification discourse that's also out there, which is, you know, it's a kind of techno-scientific way of kind of solving the world's food problems. Again, I think we would probably argue for well, no, let's be aggressive. No, we would counter that, you know, those types of narratives. I think. Is that okay on that front? So, do we have any other comments or observations? Yes.
A little comments on the discussion. So, do you think it's actually the methods that you're using, so the multidimensional approach and let's say, and the idea of trade-off that maybe is influencing this idea that you seems to be or positive on short chain, so the idea on local. So probably is the way you study things that shows, allow to show also how local chain can be sustainable using different dimension. Is it possible to say something like that? Or just to follow what he says, because actually he says that the impression was that all the speakers was pro-local, but it could be a result of the methods.
I think that is it's a very interesting observation. I mean, it certainly is what the proposers of local food chains would argue, is that they do encompass a wider range of benefits. But I think, you know, that they are more social, they're more attached to their locality, therefore environmental, that they're more seasonal products. All these sort of things I'm sure we're all familiar with. But I think Glamur is saying, yes, that is the case, but don't get sucked exclusively down that way of looking at it, because it is not that simple. And we need to recognize, and if Gianluca was here, I can almost hear him say, we need to understand how local food chains and the benefits of local food chains can influence more global chains to be more sustainable, to have a better, in quotes, performance, and vice versa. You know, there are lots of lessons that local chains can learn from global chains, for example, around logistics, how to actually get the food from the place of production to consumption. It might work at a very local level, but certainly there have been a series of papers and research in the UK that I'm aware of, which have, for example, just on the simple metric of food miles, are suggesting that if you're just buying on the basis of food miles, go to your local supermarket, because if you drive more than, I think the figure is 7 kilometers each way for your trip to go to the local shop, you're better off actually thinking about sourcing it in a different way. So logistics is something that certainly local chains, for example, could learn from global chains.
Perhaps time for one final comment. There doesn't have to be a final comment, but if anyone who feels they'd like to ask a question hasn't had a chance, stick your hand up. We'll be having lunch, so we can carry on the discussion there if you like. So I think looking at the time and the fact that we probably all need some lunch, we'll draw the discussion to a close. So just to say thanks to everyone for their comments, to thank our 4 speakers for their excellent and very insightful papers. And I'll pass over to Luca now, who will just say a few words about our Glamur cartoon.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed also on my side. Thank you for coming. Thank you also to the European Commission that hosted and was very collaborative in organizing these events, so I'm really thankful. If you're not too hungry, we have a kind of premiere because one of the dissemination tools Glamur has is a cartoon to disseminate the Glamur content to the wider audience. And this is a real premiere because not even some of my partners here have seen it. And this is not a validated cartoon by all the partners, so don't take it as a final version. It has still to be finalized a bit, but we are very glad to show you and also to use you as a test. Why not? So please also comment on this while having the lunch. So this is the Glamur cartoon.
Stop the recording on YouTube.
Is it better to eat global or to eat local food? What do these terms mean? Is it possible to compare the performance of global and local food chains? In order to answer these questions, the European Union has commissioned Glamur, a multidisciplinary research project that has involved a consortium of 15 different partners from 10 European countries. 5 dimensions: economic, ethical, health, environmental and social have guided the Glamur research, which has identified several attributes, 24 in all, to evaluate the performance of a food chain. The research has applied different tools and methods to analyze, for example, the environmental impact of a food chain in terms of its production, consumption and disposal cycle, the hidden costs that make up the price of a product, the degree of resource efficiency of different productive systems, and the social perception of global and local food chains. 7 food products have been analyzed in the Glamur project: bread, pork meat, cheese, wine, tomatoes, apples, and berries. For each product, global and local food chains have been studied by researchers in 2 different countries. Pairing the product case studies in this way made it easier to compare the results. The Glamur project has shown how the assessment of a food chain in terms of its sustainability requires a multidimensional and multi-scale approach. Local chains were shown to be drivers of innovation that help to improve the sustainability of the whole food system and often better represent the interests of farmers and rural communities. For this reason, they deserve special attention. The disparity of power relations between local and global chains is a key distinguishing feature. However, while in some contexts global chains marginalize local chains, in other cases the 2 chains coexist or overlap. Studying the dynamics and connections between global and local food chains helps to discover sustainability paths. It shows where practices and assessment tools can be improved, and it guides the behaviors of food chain actors, including the final consumer.
Thank you very much. Lunch is available.
not quite as fully, but to some extent, certainly in this part of the project, we were all.
So there.
And
In terms of the discussions about global.
To use you as a